And now I would like to proceed to the keynote speech today. Our keynote speaker for today's topic is Professor Robin Williams. I would like to introduce Professor Robin Williams first, about his background. Robin Williams is Professor of Social Research on Technology and Director of Institute for the Study of Science, Technology and Innovation, Head of Science, Technology and Innovation Studies in Edinburgh University. Now we shall welcome Professor Robin Williams.
Wonderful, the technology is now working. Can I start by thanking you also for the very kind invitation to come here. It's very exciting to be here. It's my first trip to Taiwan, and some people I've already met, and good to see them again, and very nice to meet some new friends from Taiwan and from other parts of the world. So I look forward to today's discussion. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my own research, which comes from a field of science and technology studies, and I've been working in this area for far too long, for about 30 years. And we've had a chance to think about how you design research, how you develop theories that can help understand the relationship between technology and society, and how you develop methodologies. And the background I'm coming from is a background which is very much emerged in North European and American context for understanding the relationship between technology and society. And my colleague Donald Mackenzie developed the Social Shaping of Technology framework, which was concerned to understand the effects of technology on society, but also asked, where is the technology coming from that is having these effects? So can we understand the mutual shaping between technology and society? And that involved us doing something that many social scientists don't do, which is to open the black box of technology and to look at how society is being imprinted in technology, as well as how technology artifacts are being incorporated into social relations. So that was where we were 25 years ago. And then a little later we've developed another set of frameworks for understanding this, which we called social learning, which saw that first we were wanting to look at technology design, and design was where the artifacts were being shaped. And we discovered through our research that innovation was not restricted to design, but also artifacts were being reinvented in their use, in their implementation and use. So the telephone, for example, was originally a business tool, became used as a tool for everyday communication. The internet, email wasn't designed as an application for widespread social use, nor was SMS. Those were reinvented by users. And so we looked at the way that users would take an artifact, find properties that it had, and find new uses of that artifact. So we saw the user as an active player in innovation, fitting technology to their own culture and purposes. Their different cultural purposes, often in ways that were surprising and not anticipated by developers. And so, as a result, we began to look not just at the settings of design, but also at the settings of implementation and use of technology. And we began to look at how technologies evolve over multiple cycles of design, implementation, and use. And that's what led us to develop our latest perspective, which we call the biography of artifacts perspective. And we needed this also because the context was changing. When we first started this work, we were talking about computer systems, but now we talk about information infrastructures, and this refers to the fact that the computer networks and systems are becoming interconnected, they're becoming more comprehensive in their scope, and they're becoming more extensive in their range. They're becoming heterogeneous, they're being networked, there's a network of networks. And my colleague Eric Montero and Ola Hanseth have termed the idea of information infrastructure to explain this. Now, information infrastructure is a little bit complicated for the social sciences to grasp. Why? Because they're large-scale, enduring, complex, interconnected, integrated. And as a result, you're always building the new with elements of the past, and every element that you're building now is part of tomorrow's legacy system instantly. So you need to. So the language we had of talking about design and implementation and use is already wrong, because design and implementation are now happening in parallel at all times. When you build a new component, it's always with previously designed components when you implement a new component. So we're developing a new language to help us think about how infrastructures emerge and evolve. And for example, we had a recent edition of the Journal of the Association of Information Societies special issue on infrastructures with a whole set of new concepts. For example, you can't talk about designing infrastructures, you have to think of infrastructuring as an ongoing process because you're building for now and 5, 10, 20 years in the future. So your activists are always building on multiple time frames. So there's some analytical challenges in addressing these developments. And if you look at the existing work, I'm going to talk to you today about my own work on the area of enterprise systems, which are the most studied kinds of information infrastructure. And when we look at the research, there's a lot of research, a great deal of research. It's often very theoretically weak. It often resorts unthinkingly to rather simplistic methodologies. So we see, for example, especially in the North American context, resort to large-scale surveys where you look at 10, 20, 100 implementations. And when you do that, you lose your specific knowledge about the context, the organizational context, the technological context in which the technology is being designed. And you see people desperately trying to use regression coefficients to pull out what the critical success factors, and your heart sometimes gives up, all hope is extinguished as they fail signally to find out what the critical success factors were. So large-scale surveys provide a very, very, which might be good for mapping the trajectories of planets, but are not very good for mapping these very complex developments, which are very contextual. So large-scale surveys don't work. What we see is the predominance of organisation cases, especially studies of the implementation of enterprise resource planning systems, the more social side, the kind of business school, that's what they do, they do company case studies. The more social scientific ones do ethnographies, usually of context of use, sometimes of context of design. But there's a predominance of single site cases, 95% of the studies are single site cases. And you see the predominance of short-term studies. Studies limited by the duration of typical awards, which mean you do something in a 1 or 2 year period at maximum. So they're limited to particular moments of technology design or particular moments of technology implementation. And one has to say they either arrive too soon or leave too soon or arrive too late. So short-term studies are particularly unhelpful. And the final thing is that the studies are fragmented by disciplinary perspectives. So the business studies people are primarily looking at implementation. The technology studies people might be looking at design but not implementation. So different disciplines have had different framings on different parts of the process. And so, in particular, design and implementation are rarely studied together. And that is a difficult problem. In fact, if you look at the dominant literature, the failure to look at design and implementation together produces a misinterpretation of these technologies. So my argument is that we need, not only in this area, but all of our areas, to have more effective and more appropriate analytical templates. And I think one thing that we see in our field of technology studies is a failure to reflect upon how the choice of research design may shape the findings. Now, when I first started working in this field in the late 1970s, early 1980s, everybody was focusing on case studies as a research method. And I don't know if anyone's here old enough to remember John Child, who was then a famous professor in organizational studies, theorized the possibility of choice, or organizational choice, in how technologies were implemented and used. And that was taken up by technology studies. But of course, when you do a case study, and in particular when you do 2 case studies, the thing that hits you in the face is how different they are one from another. So case studies, one or small number of case studies, automatically make you think about choice. They're good at explicating choice. They're not very good at exploring the constraints on choice. But if I look back now at the work I was doing in 1980, on implementation of technology into workplaces in 1980, when I theorized how much choice there was through 6 case studies, if I look back now, what I would be struck by was how similar those 1980s workplaces were to each other in comparison to how different to 21st century workplaces are today. 21st century workplaces have maybe each worker has 10 microprocessors linked to them. Yeah? They're profoundly different. Hierarchies are there. So if I did a long-term study, what would strike me was not the scope for choice, but the way in which, across a whole range of organisational settings, choice had been constrained by the availability of technologies and the associated changing models of good organisational design. So I'd be struck by the lack of choice. So different methodologies would give you tools for explaining different things. Different methodologies have different choice, different effectiveness, but seeing different things and coming to different kinds of explanation. And yet, you rarely see people discussing that aspect of why they choose particular methodologies. Now, one consequence of this is that we want to criticise the automatic resort to particular kinds of methodology, and in particular fairly simplistic methodologies which have unfortunately prevailed in this area. And I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the implementation study in the workplace ethnography, which have been the dominant mode of study of enterprise systems. And the biography of artifacts perspective is developed as an alternative to that. And I think, well, the starting point has been actually the success of work inspired by people like Lucy Suchman, who drew our attention to the contexted, situated view of organisational activities. And she shows how within an organisation, much of human action doesn't emerge from an organisational plan, the objectives of the firm. It occurs through the improvisatory action by human actors trying to get the firm to work and deal with constantly changing situations. Now, this perspective that Suchman gave us, this interactionist perspective, has been extraordinarily influential, extraordinarily productive. And it's been so productive that willy-nilly almost all researchers doing good social science research have been drawn to do very detailed workplace ethnographies, and they've produced extremely valuable understandings of just how complex organisational activities are. Much more complex than the computer scientists initially wanted to acknowledge. So it's been very productive. On the other hand, it's resulted in an unquestioning adoption of the single-site ethnography. It's been accompanied by a localist turn, an emphasis on how one workplace is different from another workplace. And one of the features that we want to argue today are that workplace studies are limited. They're limited to the immediate actions and operations of organisation members. They rarely span the gulf between implementation and design. And they're poorly equipped to address some of the generalised features of workplace settings, and in particular in a world where increasingly information infrastructures are linking workplaces together. And it was in this context that we proposed the biography of artifacts perspective. And we said, let's move away from single workplace. We want to keep the richness of ethnographic study, but we want to extend the scope of ethnographic study. And we introduced the idea of strategic ethnography, where you move beyond a single site to other sites that may be important. How do you know which sites are important? Well, theory helps you explore things. You can't choose your empirical settings wheel. Sometimes there's opportunities takes place as well. But moving away from particular sites and moments of innovation to look beyond design, beyond implementation, to reach back into technical design, and also to look at maintenance, procurement, the different moments in the life cycle of a particular artifact. And to look at multiple time frames, to look at short-term and long-term historical studies. And actually, in our case, we were lucky because we were able to combine, Neil Pollock and I were able to combine a number of research projects that we'd undertaken over 2 decades. And I have to say that when we looked at it over 2 decades, we came up with a radically different, in fact, totally different. My first study in this area was conducted in 1987, and I look now at my findings, and they were wrong. I won't go into that, but I'll discuss that later. They were wrong. And an extended time base gave us a very different perspective on what was at stake. So what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about enterprise systems that, for example, are run by SAP, and all the top 100 UK firms use SAP enterprise systems. These are kind of comprehensive bits of software that run all the things that a firm needs to do, like production, accounting, personnel, etc., etc. This is an advert in Shanghai International Airport. You can probably read that better than I can. But it says that this multinational detergent manufacturer it runs SAP, not the other way around. Now, of course, Satchman's perspective, which emphasised locality, which said every organisation is different from every other organisation, from that perspective, SAP could not provide a technology that could be implemented in every organisation. So this was an impossible thing to happen. So if you ask most people in organisation studies, and lots of people in computer sciences, they would say the only question is how SAP has been able to sell its bad technology to stupid managers. Yeah? And that's how they interpret it. And that's not a plausible explanation, I have to say. It has succeeded in doing it. SAP did conquer the world, but it's not through the engineers' view that they would provide a universal solution. That was their view. They would provide a universal solution that catered for all firms. And of course, they tried to do that in the 1960s and 50s, and they found that their standard solutions didn't work. There was a mismatch between the presumptions embodied in their standard software packages and the variety of organizational settings. Organizations are very diverse. But SAP was able to produce generic solutions that could be applied by all the top FTSE 100 companies, and I don't know what proportion of the US fortune, and I don't know how many Taiwanese, but many, I'm sure. SAP did it, but it didn't do it by providing a standard universal solution. It conquered the world one sector at a time by doing very careful work. It extended from manufacturing into other sectors like chemical, and then into public, into banking, and then into public services. It addressed each sector and its requirements and moved on from that. And it had some problems in some areas. It had difficulties entering the customer relationship management, which had very different presumptions. How did it do this? It did this through a process we call generification. And we saw, well actually we weren't able to go back in time and look at SAP 20 years ago. When we looked at other software companies that had a useful application in one, we developed for one customer, which they were trying to turn into a package. We saw how they'd sold a piece of software to Edinburgh University, and then they were trying to sell it to other universities. And how in so doing, each time they got a new customer, the new customer had new and different requirements. And then in the early stages of the project, the software became more and more complex as bells and whistles were added on for each customer in turn. And then some of the customers had demands that were unhelpful for other customers. So there was a danger that the particular customer's requirements would be an obstacle to the uptake of the technology elsewhere. So they had to learn to manage the diversity of their user base. And we saw that they actually had very sophisticated policies in place to segment the market. They divided the market. They had kind of key customers who were their pilot demonstrator sites. There were kind of core markets for them, and there were other groups who they saw as commodity users. And if the other groups had particular needs, they could have them met if they paid for it. But there were some core customers whose needs, and in particular the pilot sites, whose needs were seen as salient, and they built their package around the examples of their demonstration sites, their pilot sites. And then we saw that they actually had, that they weren't designing in isolation, that SAP, and I'll talk about SAP, it may or may not be SAP, could have been Oracle, could have been Edges. They would have meetings like this, where all the potential users of their new product would be saying, well, this is how university, we did a study of the university. This is how we do it in our place. And they said, well, the American university does it this way. Well, the British company university, well, they do it a slightly different way. So they then began to organise the different practices across different universities and decide how much of the variety was going to be taken forward. And they listed the users, in fact, as partners in knowledge elicitation and partners in harmonisation of practices across universities. So a very complicated process of sifting and smoothing and aligning expectations until they could create a package that could reach to pretty well most of that class of organisations. It wasn't that those organisations were the same, but they could be treated as the same. A doable bridge. A bridge could be made between the generic assumptions of the package and the diversity of most of the users in the market. So there was a very complex relationship between supplier and a community of users that was taking place. So that we looked at then at the design, the supply-user relation. We also looked at another moment, which is a key moment, procurement. And here we're looking at a local authority procuring an enterprise solution. And they've kind of done the beauty test, which you do when you're buying software. You ask the vendors to provide specifications of their solutions, and they've distilled it down to 3 candidates. And one emerged as favourite, a new company nobody's heard of. And since this company had no reference sites, the council asked the industry analyst Gartner, Gideon Gartner Associates, to provide a report as part of due diligence, checking references. And Gideon Gartner says, we've never heard of them. And then the company says, well, you haven't heard of us because we're not a customer relationship management supplier. We provide integrated solutions. We have a different market. So it looked for a while as if there was going to be a fight between Gartner and the new vendor about the poverty of the new vendor. And eventually an agreement takes place between Gartner and new vendor about why it is that the new vendor isn't on the lists. But when the local authority members get back home and think about what they do, they've suddenly changed their opinion about the new vendor. And the new vendor, who had been seen as the preferred candidate, they were going to develop a system for us, is now seen as the least preferred candidate. They can use us as a guinea pig. So a shift in attitude is taking place because new vendor isn't on the list. And what we see there is the emergence of a new class of actor, industry analysts. Now the problem when you're buying software is that these bits of software cost £1 million. And then you won't know how well they work for you unless you spend another £1 million in implementing it. So we're talking 40 million Taiwanese dollars. A lot of money to find, you can't observe its properties. They're far too complex. All you can do is see the software installed somewhere else. And if you're seeing the software installed somewhere else, you have to decide A, whether it's the same package, and B, whether the organisation is sufficiently similar to your own organisation to have important lessons for you. So learning how useful a piece of software is becomes very difficult. And it's in this context, I mean, traditionally then firms would use network reputations. They'd ask others in their community if they knew of the firm. The trouble is that's a very inefficient way of learning. And the industry analysts, Gartner's as industry analysts, have emerged as people who have links with all the vendors. The vendors pay them a large subscription, all the adopters. Adopters pay a large subscription fee to get Gartner's services. And in exchange, the adopters tell Gartner how well the package works for them. And then Gartner sells that information on to other potential customers. So Gartner has emerged as a key intermediary. And we discuss this as we see that the market for IT products has a new knowledge infrastructure, and it's an infrastructure that revolves around the idea of a technology domain, shall we say, enterprise systems for universities or local authorities. And this domain is a place in which expectations are mobilized, and it's also a place in which complex decisions can be simplified, uncertainty can be managed. And in particular, it's a place where comparative assessment can be made of different vendors. And if you know anything about Gartner, the thing you probably know about them is they introduced this thing called the Magic Quadrant, where they rate the current and performance and future potential performance of all the vendors on a 2x2 matrix. And if you're not in the top right-hand corner of the matrix, then you're not going to sell many of your products. So very powerful. So the technology field emerges as a place where Gartner has authority in making an assessment through its complex networks with links with vendors, in particular links with customers who are able to give some feedback about the operation of these complex products. So, and Gartner employs various tools, lists of who the players are, and in particular this magic quadrant. And of course, its decisions have enormous consequences for the sales that the customers, that the vendors have. And every time Gartner produces a new packet, it measures by millimetre if they're moved or not. So Gartner emerges as a key player. So the point about this is that when we started our study, we hadn't anticipated the importance of this new class of actor and these new spaces and the complex web of relations that link together organisational users of technology, vendors, consultants, industry analysts, and then we discovered there are other kinds of people. There are analyst relations experts who help vendors sell their products to the industry analysts. And then there are consultant relations who help organizational users decide which consultant to buy. Because if you go to one of the big 8, they'll tell you to buy IBM. If you go to another one, they'll tell you to. So actually, your choice of consultant is important. So other kinds of meta expertise are emerging. And these turn out to be quite key in the way that the IT market is unfolding. What lessons do we draw? And when we have time, I'll close quite quickly. First of all, is that you can't understand these phenomena as a single site or moment of interaction. You need to attend to different levels and time frames. The immediate context of action is important, and you see things happening there. But you need to look at how those how the local action is taking place in a larger web of relationships. And a lot of the things which are happening in the interstitial spaces. They're happening where, at the conference, the Gartner conference, where an organizational user speaks to a Gartner analyst, or they're happening in the vendor user club. So they're happening in interstitial spaces, and it's difficult for social scientists to be there, to be at the right place. We argue in particular that you shouldn't be looking at supply and use apart. And you also need to look at the technology field, the translational terrain in which technologies are being shaped. So go beyond, not just have local studies, but produce local studies in their broader context. So we need new integrative models of analysis, new templates for doing that analysis, comprising local, broad, short-term, longer-term frames of movement. And the other thing we may need is a reorientation to theory and methods. And we've offered the concept of biography as a tool for analysis. We think it offers some templates for people in terms of time framing and the spaces which we study, better templates than the single site study for doing research. And we haven't, I don't know if you're very familiar with Bruno Latour and actor network theory, which is very influential in the West. And Bruno Latour says, well, just follow the actor. And actually we like Latour because he does say, well, don't start with a predefined theoretical cue as to who you should look at. But then he doesn't tell you which actor to go to. And there's a choice involved, a theoretical and often a political choice in deciding which actors are important. And Latour's actor network theory, his naive empiricism, leaves unaccountable the choice that actor network theory is making when it decides which actor to view. So we're concerned about the current popularity of actor network theory in its espousal of these rather anti-theoretical, naive epistemologies. Instead, we see, and we ask Latour why he says that, and he says, well, if you have a theory, it's like a set of theoretical blinkers. So for him, and he's coming from French structuralism, for him, theory is like a sausage machine. So you have your theory, and everything will be the result of a category of class or gender structures or patriarchy or colonialism. And theory precludes the conclusions. Well, that's a very strange view of theory, I think. It's a very mechanistic view of theory. And we think theory is important because it tells you theory is an abstracted empirical findings which tell you what kind of relations are important and which need to be attended to. But we would like to see theory as a tool for analysis rather than a set of blinkers. And so we think that researchers need to be using theory in designing methodologies, but having methodologies and conceptual frameworks which are open to exploring new kinds of relationship and new spaces which weren't anticipated at the outset of their journey. So that's really what I have to say. The other thing is that we think, I mean, not everybody, I don't know if there are any PhD students here, but their supervisors would be very upset if I say our real insights came from doing something over 20 years, and the PhD supervisor will say, for God's sake, don't allow, people have to do their PhD in 3 years. Of course, we can't all do large biography studies, but we can combine a number of studies together. And we think that we want to propose a different approach to research, where each individual study is conceived as part of a larger collective program of inquiry that produces a better and more effective observation. And that means that research is a team task. And that's a different view of research that is often prevailed in the social science area. I better stop that one. Thanks very much.
Thanks a little bit over. Do you want to have some Q&A, questions and answers?
If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Any questions here, please?
Very quick question.
Yeah.
I think this is a very excellent speech. Two questions now. Your approach is very based on process oriented. And what is the differences between your approach to the social shaping of technology, because you're talking about the process? The second question related to this is, how do you select the case? Because I don't see very clearly what is your dependent variable. I mean, what is the significance of the phenomena you are going to discuss, and what is the criteria you select? For example, set is a good example, but in B school they're talking about performance or something like that, and therefore the selected cases depends on that kind of dependent variable. And what is the criteria you select?
Those are very helpful questions. Thank you. Very interesting. I mean, the first thing is yes, we are looking back at process. And I was at Aston University Work Organisation Research Centre, where we saw business studies move from a view of the cookbook solution as its goal to an understanding of processes of organisational change. So we are doing processual studies, but I think we're also interested in how process is shaped by structure and context. So we are, and I think that's why sometimes we may want to move out beyond the local, where you see the process in detail, to larger scale and comparative studies where you can see how processes are shaped by context. The second is, how do you choose your cases? Well, I think that has to be argued for. It depends, crucially, on the concerns of your study. And we had a PhD student who was doing a study of banking in Greece. And he did 2 studies and showed how, for an implementation study, the obvious actors to look at were bank unions, bank managers, the bank's immediate suppliers, and they were local actors, and then there were other players who were part of the wider view, European Union, the Microsoft. So from that view, from an implementation point of view, there was a certain range of actors he wanted to look at. And then he said, well, he did another study, which was a supply-side study about the development of applications for banking technologies. And for there, the range of players and influencers were different. There, the technology companies the local technology companies were in direct discussion with the global technology companies. So you saw a different map of players and different relations. So and then he said, well, actually, both of these are only partial framings. You've involved some kind of presumptions in both of these framings, and can we become more reflexive about what happens when we decide who I mean, we use the idea of a zoom lens, where there are some foregrounded players, and then you zoom out, so you make sure you get the background possibly fitted in. But when you're making these framings, then you're presupposing something about the relationships which are at stake. And I think the argument is, of course, we can't all study every actor over an extended period of time. We have to make those framings, but we may need to make much more accountable why we are making those framings and explain them in terms of our theories about what's important in the world and about the thing we're trying to explicate. And that's an argument that needs to be made, but it needs to be made actively, and unfortunately a lot of our colleagues make it by default, by automatically perceiving a particular framing.
Thank you very much.